They told her mother was a simple woman. They were lying. The rain came in sheets the night Naomi Richardson died, smearing the city lights into a watercolor of reds and golds against the hospital's high windows. Inside room 612, the fluorescent ceiling lights hummed a steady, indifferent chorus. Machines kept time. A nurse with tired eyes smoothed a blanket over the old woman's thin shoulders, as if that could soothe what had already been decided. Maya sat beside the bed, palms pressed against the cool plastic of the rail, and watched the life she had always known recede into a series of small, private gestures. Naomi's thumb combing an invisible pattern on the bedsheet, the way she mouthed a word without sound when she couldn't find it. When Naomi's hand grew lighter in Maya's grip, she still opened her eyes for a moment, and they were as sharp as the edge of a coin. "Listen," she said, not with the breathless desperation of a dying person, but with the steady hush of someone giving final instructions. Her voice was a raw whisper that did not carry out to the corridor. "Box 447, key in the jewelry box. Promise me, Maya. Don't tell—" She coughed, then forced a smile that didn't reach the thin lines at the corners of her mouth. "Be careful who you trust." Maya promised. Promises, she thought then, are brittle things until they are kept. She didn't know how much would hinge on that one small brass key. The funeral the following week was a quiet, dreary thing under a gray sky that seemed to echo the hospital's rain. People who had known Naomi for years stood in small groups, trading memories about casseroles, volunteering shifts at the community center, the time she rescued a stranded kitten. A photograph of Naomi on an easel captured a softness, hands folded, eyes laughing, and the obituary called her a devoted mother, a woman of modest means and modest appetites. Maya watched, feeling as though the world were showing her a portrait through smoked glass. Nothing in those polite condolences prepared her for what would be hidden in a small inner drawer of the oak jewelry box she'd always thought held costume necklaces and a few faded brooches. It was an afternoon a week after the service when she found the key. Naomi's apartment smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. The jewelry box was exactly where it had always been, a carved little thing with a brass latch that had once been stuck in place and required a careful twist to free. Maya opened it with fingers that trembled and lifted an envelope. No, a soft pouch, and inside, cradled like a secret, lay a tiny brass key the color of pennies. Attached was a note in Naomi's handwriting, the letters cramped and careful. "For when you are ready. Do not let anyone know, Maya. Not Marcus, not Shanice, not even Harold until you insist." Harold, Maya knew the name as a family lawyer in New York, a man Naomi had mentioned only once on a long phone call years ago, in a tone that suggested both gratitude and caution. Naomi's note left off with a sentence that made Maya's throat close. "If you can, come quickly. There is work to be done." The key looked ordinary until she turned it over and saw the tiny stamped numbers along the neck. 447. Her stomach rolled in a way she couldn't name. A safety deposit box. She had walked past that bank slide of marble in town 1,000 times, never imagining a private little archive of a life so different from the one people assumed Naomi had led. A week later, under a drizzle that had become a week-long companion, she pushed open the heavy door of First National and stood before Gerald Whitmore, the branch manager, a man with a permanent frown that seemed to organize his face into a kind of bureaucratic readiness. The bank smelled of disinfectant and polished wood. The clerk asked for identification. Maya handed over Naomi's death certificate and the brass key. Gerald's eyes lingered in a way that was politely sympathetic, the kind of gaze meant to reassure, not to startle. He led her down a corridor lined with security panels and into a room where metal boxes blinked and a guard waited. Box 447 slid open with a hum. Inside lay a slim cream envelope, the flap sealed with wax. There was also a leather-bound notebook with a few pressed flowers tucked into its pages, and a small stack of documents that at first looked like financial drabness, statements, lists, a ledger. Maya's heart began to hammer. She lifted the envelope and held it between her hands like a lamp. Naomi's handwriting filled the front page, but it was not the timid grocery list script Maya remembered. It was crisp, assertive, the script of someone who had written letters and contracts, not just notes to a child about dinner menus. Naomi's confession did not read like the meandering memories of a life lived simply. It read like a ledger, then a narrative, then evidence. Naomi Ashford, the letter began, using a name Maya had heard once as a joke, her mother's maiden name. Maya's breath fogged in the air. Naomi explained in that brisk, unshowy way that she had been born into one life and bootstrapped herself into another. She had married once and lost that marriage to circumstance, to choices she made out of fear. Then she had learned to invest small sums, to buy stakes in companies no one else valued, to collect art and mineral rights and small parcels of land that would, over decades, appreciate in ways that surprised her. "I did not want you to inherit my mistakes," Naomi wrote, "or my enemies. I wanted you to inherit the freedom I couldn't imagine as a girl." There were pages of numbers and lists, real estate holdings in remote corners of the world, shares in private firms, patents Naomi had quietly invested in through anonymous shells. The ledger read like a map, each asset a breadcrumb. The language was plain but careful. Family trust, contingent beneficiary, irrevocable allocation. At the back, under a sealed tab, a paragraph stood apart in bold legalese, followed by Naomi's own voice in the margin. "We have built something that will outlast us," the legal paragraph read. "The Ashford Family Trust, consolidated and managed across multiple jurisdictions, has been structured to preserve the estate for future generations under the stewardship of its trustee." Underneath Naomi's note, "It is more than anyone would expect. Carefully worded and conservatively valued, but understand this. Do not let the press measure us by the newspaper's appetite." She had not written a single precise number, yet the magnitude hung in the air like a summer storm. Harold's name was written in the margin as the contact, with an address in Manhattan. Naomi closed the letter with a short line meant for Maya alone. "No one gets to take your life from you. Not quietly, not easily, be patient." Maya read the documents in the back room of the bank while precipitation drummed against the windows in thin ribbons. She did not understand all of what she read, but she understood enough. There were trusts, trustees, shell companies, language of motion and shelter. She understood that Naomi had arranged something deliberate, a vault within vaults. When Gerald closed the door behind him and left her alone, she felt as if the world had tilted by an imperceptible angle. She could have told Marcus. He had been her husband for 7 years. He had been there the night Naomi slipped her hand into Maya's and told her to promise. He had shown up for the funeral, standing in the back with a hand tucked in his coat, like someone arriving merely to be seen as present. He had been the one to make coffee for her the morning she found the key. He had been the one to say, with a gentle, comforting tone, "We'll get through this, babe." Instead, she tucked the envelope into her bag and walked home through the drizzle like someone carrying contraband. The key weighed less than a dime, but more than conscience. She did not tell Marcus. Not yet. At home, the apartment felt bigger than it used to. Layers of Naomi's life echoed in furniture and teacups. Marcus moved through the rooms with an unfamiliar economy, as if his gestures were being rationed. He was polite, but distant, as if her grief were a thing he needed to manage carefully around, not within. 2 weeks after the funeral, he brought a stack of papers to the kitchen table. There was a manila folder with, "For signature," written on top in his neat, practical hand. Maya's hands clenched. She could not stop herself, not then, not in the preliminary shock. "I think we should talk about separating," Marcus said, speaking softly so that the words landed like stray feathers on the table. Maya stared at him. "What?" "It's not working," he said, as if the difference between not working and failing to love were a matter of vocabulary. He used phrases that sounded rehearsed. "We need time to figure ourselves out. We each deserve people who make us whole. I don't want to hurt you." She wanted to ask him for the truth. Was he tired of the dinner announcements, of the small gestures, of Naomi's memory hovering between them? She wanted to throw the envelope on the table, reveal the key, make everything explode into the open. Instead, she let him speak. She watched him fold himself into a future that did not include her, and felt a strange clinical emptiness settle in her chest. The same clear-eyed vacancy you feel after a storm, when the ground is sodden and you know the work of rebuilding has to start. And then a week later in a cafe that used to be their place, rain-splattered windows, people hunched over laptops, a barista calling out names in a friendly drone, Maya saw him. Marcus was sitting at a corner table, sunless even through the rain. He had his coat off. He was leaning in close to Shanice, her laugh bright as a bell, her hand on the curve of his wrist. Shanice had been Maya's oldest friend, the person who had shown up to the hospital at odd hours with freshly microwaved soup and stale gossip. The person who had once let Maya cry on her shoulder in the parking lot after a bad day. Maya paused at the threshold, the world constricting to the warm lamplight over that corner table. She watched, and for an instant everything felt unreal, like watching actors through a train window. Shanice's eyes were shining. Marcus's hand cupped her cheek. She leaned in and kissed him, quick at first, then longer. There was a small gleam of a ring box on the table. Maya could not be sure what it held, but whatever it was, it belonged to a plan Marcus and Shanice had not yet made public. A laugh bubbled from Shanice, and something in the way Marcus looked at her made Maya feel as if she had come upon a private joke at which she had never been invited. She did not speak to them. She left the cafe, the rain catching on her eyelashes and making bright dots where the city lights refracted. Betrayal is a shape that hardens into decisions. In that wet blur outside the cafe, she made one. She would not tell them she knew. The choice was not born of malice. It was born of calculation. Naomi's words were still in her ears, an urgent hush against the noise of life. Be careful who you trust. If her mother had gone to such lengths to shield a legacy, not only from the outside world but from the inside of her own family, Maya wondered how many other small deceptions had been nested within bigger, quieter ones. She imagined for a moment the chaos that would follow disclosure, lawyers combing through personal devices, tabloids spinning narratives, Marcus and Shanice smelling of scandal and entitlement. Naomi had crafted protections that were meaningless if the secret, the key, became a club wielded by two people who had already proven they could not be relied upon. Instead, Maya booked a flight to New York. She told Marcus she needed space. She said she wanted to visit Harold, to understand what the trust meant. He nodded with the fragile grace of a man who thinks of distance as a cure for discomfort. He put his hand to her face once in that slow, possessive way of people who have rehearsed affection, and she let him. It was easier not to cause a scene, to let him continue believing there were uncollided futures on both sides of an ocean. New York was a different kind of weather, a slate sky, the wind as if it wanted to move things along. The city smelled of rain and diesel and the sharp citrus cut of paper. Harold Ashford's office was on the 23rd floor of a building with a numberless marble lobby, and a receptionist who looked for a moment like someone remembering a story she had been told years ago. Harold himself was not what the movies would make of a family lawyer. He was shorter than Maya had imagined, with a wallet chain of white hair at his temple, and eyes that did not blink often, the kind that watched people as if cataloging their parts. "Ms. Richardson," he said, standing and extending a hand that was all business and little warmth. He ushered her into a room lined with books and with a small framed black and white photograph of a younger Naomi on a bench, hair blowing in wind as if she had been attempting some foolish liberation. "I'm sorry about your mother," Harold said. He clasped his hands like a man checking the fit of a plan. She was someone who kept her affairs well, she kept them close. Harold explained the basics in the ways lawyers do. Irrevocable trusts, contingent beneficiaries, the nature of separation between personal assets and estate holdings. He explained that Naomi had, over decades, pooled assets into a network of trusts that were managed under several jurisdictions to ensure resilience and privacy. He used terms like consolidated portfolio and fiduciary obligations with an ease that suggested he had been carrying this vocabulary with him for a long time. "Your mother asked me to act as a steward until she was sure you would be ready," he said. "She left instructions that in the event of her passing, you would be contacted and guided through the activation process. There are several stages. One is for preliminary disclosure, basic facts. The next involves trustee appointments and the formal transfer of certain management rights. Those are done under strict confidentiality. Maya felt the soft, cold approach of trepidation wrap around her. "How big is it?" she asked, the question arriving too thinly to carry the weight it needed to. Harold hesitated. He had the look of someone who had practiced being cagey. "It is substantial. At present, conservative valuation, your mother's assets comprise a family trust that, depending on market conditions and recent revaluations, would be described in the press as a trillionaire estate. At peak consolidated valuations, various assets have collectively been estimated to exceed $1 trillion. He let the syllable sit in the room like a new piece of furniture. Maya watched the way the light bent off the glass on his desk, how the room seemed suddenly too small for a thing like that. Naomi had died in a small hospital bed, in a modest apartment full of mismatched plates, and now Harold was using a word that belonged to the world of superlatives and obscene valuations measured in zeros. "Trillion," Maya repeated, tasting the syllable as if it were foreign currency. It made no sense in the tight economy of her memories. Naomi in an apron handing over a paper cup of coffee, Naomi in a frayed cardigan humming while she scrubbed dishes. Why would she keep it secret? "Many reasons," Harold said. "Privacy being foremost. Your mother was very concerned with stewardship, ensuring that the funds served purpose and didn't burn like fuel in the wrong hands. She also feared that knowledge of the trust might change the nature of your relationships. She wanted to be sure that you inherited not just the estate, but the ability to steward it. She wanted you to be able to make choices free of pressure." Maya thought of Marcus and Shanice in the cafe, the small ring box glinting on the table like a secret future. She thought of Naomi's final admonition. "She told me not to tell anyone," she said. "She was very clear." Harold nodded. "She was. That's why some of these assets were placed in pass-through entities and administered through trustees who would not normally disclose beneficiary details without the beneficiary's express consent. Naomi asked that the first mover be you, that you would decide how much of this you wished to reveal, and when." He slid a manila packet across the desk. On top was a one-page summary, the sort of document designed for the moment between explanation and comprehension. It read, in formal type, "Ashford Family Trust, Consolidated Assets and Overview." There were lists, industries, asset classes, holdings. Under private equity, under global real estate portfolio, under art and collectibles, each bullet carried the metrics of magnitude, but not the breathless drama of gossip. There was a figure at the bottom, not shouted but underlined in a neat administrative hand. Estimated consolidated peak valuation, $1.1 trillion. The numbers entered her vision like a slow tide. She felt something accordion in her chest. It might have been grief. It might have been something cheek-deep and corrosive and fierce. She had been taught to use money for groceries and the occasional plane ticket. Her mother had taught herself, in quiet and private ways, to build a kingdom. "You understand," Harold said quietly, "that with this comes scrutiny. Others may become interested. There are philanthropic commitments your mother initiated. Those will need to be honored. There are corporate governance roles to be decided. There are trustees who will need direction. Your mother's letter," he smiled with a little concession to humanity, "is blunt. You must decide who in your life will be trusted with this knowledge." The word scrutiny felt like someone turning a key in a lock. Maya thought of the soft brass key that had opened box 447, how small and ordinary it had felt in her hand. This speech about trustees and governance made that key look like a child's toy beside a bank vault of unimaginable scale. Harsh realities threaded through her. Reporters, opportunists, legal teams, late-night pundits. The possibility of losing something else, privacy, dignity, even the remaining control over the shape of her life, was as real as any financial ledger. She remembered Naomi's final smile and that tiny warning not to trust. She thought about Marcus and Shanice's laughter in the cafe and the way Shanice's fingers had splayed across Marcus's palm. She thought, with a fierce, small clarity, that she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her stumble. "How soon can the trustees be convened?" she asked. In weeks, Harold said. There is initial paperwork. There are formalities and filings. We will need your signature on certain consents, but we can set in motion the management directives your mother left. You can also establish intermediaries if you prefer, holding entities to purchase assets anonymously while you determine your path. Naomi anticipated discretion. She planned for someone who might prefer to act behind the scenes for a while. Maya heard the offer like a lifeline. Anonymity, she said. When Harold nodded, she saw possibilities assemble. Options that weren't brute vengeance but careful leverage, institutional push rather than burst. No one would have to know at first. She could let the trusts breathe life into a plan. Let professional mechanisms do the work that hands and hurtful words could not. There was a side of her that wanted only to use the funds to erase the sting of betrayal, to make them lose what they had thought they would gain. But Naomi's final charge had not been for revenge for its own sake. Be patient, Naomi had written. Be the steward. Make it right. Maya left Harold's office with the manila packet under her arm, and the rain a slow, steady percussion against her coat. Her phone vibrated twice in her pocket. Messages from Marcus. Short, performative. Hope you landed safely. Call me when you can. She did not call back. She walked to a small diner and sat where the glass fogged around her. The world outside moved in preordained patterns. Delivery trucks, people with umbrellas, the river like a line of dull metal. For the first time since the hospital, she allowed herself a full memory of her mother as a young woman she had never seen except in faded photographs. Naomi had been clever in a way that had nothing to do with degrees or titles. She had been patient, saving a nickel and then $1 until it rolled into something bigger. She had, somewhere along the line, discovered how to turn a quiet, lonely edge of luck into a scaffold for safety. Maya read Naomi's letter again. There were directives, lists of priorities, educational funds for girls from Naomi's old neighborhood, grants for community health centers, a set-aside for an endowed scholarship in Naomi's name to be administered by a foundation Naomi had created in secret. Naomi's handwriting, which had seemed small and private in the hospital room, unfolded like a map of intentionality. Maya pictured the scholarship like a small warm lamp. Naomi had wanted to make sure one feature of her life was public and noble. It was a point of moral clarity in the ledger, a place where Naomi had wanted sunlight to fall. She could see, in a way that surprised her, how appealing the idea was, not as weaponry but as a correction, a way to turn an act of betrayal into something larger than retribution. She thought of being small once again, fingers sticky with jam, Naomi leaning down to plait her hair. She thought of the quiet pride that had hummed through their home when Naomi counted a small victory, an extra $1 in the jar, the unexpected return on a cautious bet. Naomi had tucked those victories away in ways that would make the wrong people never guess at the scale. And now those victories were in her hands. Maya would not run headlong into fireworks. She would not hand the envelope to the tabloids or march into Marcus's workplace with a camera crew. She would learn. She would meet the trustees. She would put professionals, lawyers, accountants, advisors, between herself and the world while she considered the reach of her mother's legacy. The first night in Manhattan, alone in a rented room that smelled faintly of other people's lives, she opened the leather-bound notebook from box 447 and found a pressed hydrangea and a pressed newspaper clipping from decades ago. Naomi's handwriting in the margins was almost conversational, a half-remembered joke, a line that explained why she had once chosen a remote parcel of land in Idaho, cheap at the time, but it had contained water rights that later fed a pipeline needed by a burgeoning solar firm. Underneath, in a different ink and a steadier hand, was a sentence that stopped Maya cold. If you must do anything, make it public in a way that cannot be turned into spectacle. Make it irrevocably useful. Irrevocably useful. The words made a line from Naomi's room in the hospital to Midtown Manhattan, to a life that had, until then, been the kind of ordinary domesticity that almost felt like a penalty. Maya closed the notebook with a careful hand and let the city noise hum a steady backdrop. She called no one that night. She texted no one. She slept thinly, as if waiting for a knock at the door. When morning came, Harold had arranged for a small group to meet with her. 2 lawyers, a trustee named Margaret who introduced herself as a fiduciary with a no-nonsense haircut, and a person who called himself an asset manager. They sat at a long conference table in a room with a view of a street where people threaded umbrellas like flags. There was a soft hierarchy to the room. The professionals spoke in the measured tones of people accustomed to translating complexity into action. Naomi provided for several philanthropic initiatives in addition to the long-term holdings, Margaret said. She wanted a scholarship that would bear her name and remain separate from operational budgets of any corporate holdings. That will be one of the things we can launch to establish public good without revealing operational specifics of the trust. Maya listened, an instrument of attention. She felt like someone learning a language where each verb had consequence. They walked through the activation schedule, initial signings, board nominations, interim management directives. They spoke of anonymity, the use of holding companies and professional intermediaries to purchase assets so that her involvement would not be immediately apparent. Harold emphasized more than once the need for patience. Many of the moves suggested would take weeks or months. The arc of influence, Harold said, rarely moved in days. Maya thought of Marcus's confident stride and Shanice's laugh. She thought of how small their betrayal had been when measured against the consequences of a trust worth more than $1 trillion. She imagined, distantly, a future where the marketplace and professional governance shifted rather than smashed. A redistribution of power wielded through legal directives and personnel decisions rather than a stage-managed scandal. She liked the thought that institutions would do to careers what a private fist could not: shift incentives, tighten oversight, expose bad performance through audits and restructuring. It was not violence. It was correction. Before she left the meeting that afternoon, Harold handed her a small folder that contained Naomi's last letter, the one she had read at the bank, and a note with a list of contacts, trustees, attorneys, and the name of a CEO Naomi had trusted to run one of her smaller hospitality investments. She insisted we keep that name active, Harold said. She thought, even back then, that you might someday want a decisive executive at the helm of certain assets. Maya walked out of the building with paperwork folded beneath her arm, and a new name lodged in her head: Diane Porter. Harold had spoken of her as if pronouncing a tool, efficient, unfrilled, a person with a reputation for turning around underperforming companies. Naomi's handwriting had added in a soft loop: Diane can be trusted, tough but fair. On the subway down to the small apartment she had rented for the month, Maya read Naomi's letter again, pausing on passages that seemed less legal and more like a map of a life. Money will change things about you. It will make everything louder. Choose what to make louder. Choose your causes. Choose your people. Underline: do not let anyone else decide the answer to those questions. She closed the folder and pressed it to her chest as if holding a beating thing. In the seat across from her, a woman with a stroller nursed a baby. Outside, a street vendor sold hot pretzels to tourists. The scale of it all felt odd, insane, and matter-of-fact at once. Naomi's life had been a secret archive lodged in the modest flesh of a mother who baked bread and mended seams. Now the seam had split, and the fabric of 2 lives lay flung open. Maya thought of how power restructured rooms. She thought of the coffee shop kiss as if she had stumbled into a play midway through, the lines already written and the characters halfway to their exits. She thought of the fury that seethed in small, perfectly controlled waves across the surface of her grief. Fury that was not for spectacle but for order, an insistence that those who had betrayed her would not profane Naomi's legacy. She made a list in the little leather notebook: trustees, Naomi's philanthropic directives, the assets Naomi had marked as non-negotiable for public good. She wrote Marcus's name in the margin, and then crossed it out. Crossing a name out felt, perversely, like a mild exorcism. For the first time since Naomi's whisper in room 612, Maya felt the weight of a future she could shape. It would require time. It would require alliances. It would require patience, and a willingness to sit still while other forces moved. Above all, it would require secrecy until she decided otherwise. She had promised her mother she would be careful who she trusted. She had also promised herself she would not be passive anymore. Naomi had given her a key, a physical object that unlocked a box, yes, but more importantly, a key to a set of choices no one had expected her to master. In the week that followed, as she signed papers and set up accounts and listened to trustees explain the impossibly dull poetry of fiduciary duty, Maya kept one small secret from everyone in her life. She had no intention of letting Marcus see the ledger, the plans, the intentionality Naomi had hidden. She had no intention of letting him claim a stake in the life her mother had carefully constructed. That night, alone in the rented apartment, she opened Naomi's letter one more time and found, folded into the back, a single page she had somehow missed. It was not legalese. It was a short note, almost mischievous in tone. "My darling," it read. "If you happen to meet anyone who thinks money is a test of character, let them be tested by their choices. Keep your hands clean. Let the institutions do the work. Miss me when you can, and let me teach you from beyond the grave." A strange, bittersweet laugh escaped Maya. Naomi had always loved instruction, even in death. She felt both anger and gratitude braided together. She set the page beside her, pressed the key into her palm, as if it were a talisman, and for a moment let herself imagine a future in which the betrayal would be answered not by spectacle but by systems. Outside, the city carried on. The rain had stopped and a smear of light opened up like a promise. Maya stood and walked to the window, looking out over a skyline she had never thought much about. High above, in a room that felt like a platform for something that had not yet happened, she folded her hands and made silently a different kind of promise. She would be methodical. She would be patient. She would be precise. Later that week, Harold called and said the trustees were ready to begin the first phase. It would take time. There would be filings and audits, appointments, and interim boards. Naomi had built a system that could bend time and public perception. Now that system would be set in motion by the person Naomi had chosen. Maya closed her eyes when she heard the name of a company, Kimball & Associates, an advertising firm where Marcus worked. Her stomach dropped like a stone. She thought for a flicker of a moment of what it would mean to simply hand that file to the media, to watch careers unravel on the front pages. But Naomi's admonition against spectacle rang again in her memory. Let the institutions do the work. Let the system reconfigure itself. Let legal consequences and market realities reveal what gossip only pretends to uncover. She had learned, in the days since Naomi's death, that power could be wielded in soft, patient ways. It could move through boardrooms and trustee votes instead of the glare of 1,000 cameras. It could be quiet and devastating and efficient. When the trustees convened for the first time, it was not with fanfare but with a narrow, surgical efficiency. Harold sat at the head of the table, Margaret and the asset manager flanking him like pieces on a chessboard. Phones were on airplane mode. The meeting lasted hours. They cataloged Naomi's intents and built a timeline. Many of the moves they discussed were technical: appointments, transfers, minor restructurings to improve governance. But woven through the language of governance were tiny, powerful tools. Performance reviews, contract clauses that allowed for executive replacement in cases of gross mismanagement, the revocation of bonuses tied to specific KPIs. These were not instruments of revenge. They were structural knives that could be deployed when necessary. Maya did not speak much in that meeting. She listened, soaking up the logic of it and imagining how to use it. Her mother had not wanted noise. Naomi wanted stability, impact, permanence. The trustees spoke with a focused calm that felt, in its way, merciless. The kind of remorselessness institutions have when they apply rules without personal malice. At the end of the first day, Harold leaned over and in a voice that could have been confidential or conspiratorial said, "You don't have to decide everything now. Naomi left you the tools. You may choose how to use them. For now, let us move with discretion." Maya left that room and felt the first solid lock click into place. She would move, but not yet in ways Marcus would expect. She would let committees do what committees do best: assess, audit, adjust, while she learned the art of being powerful without showing the edges of her hand. On the subway back to the apartment, a woman got on with a small boy in a dinosaur hoodie. The boy pressed his forehead to the window and watched the world pass. Maya imagined the scholarship Naomi had written about, a girl from her old neighborhood perhaps, sitting in a classroom far from the small town where Naomi had started. Naomi's vision seemed to reach, like roots, outward into communities her mother had loved quietly. That night in her folder, a page had one small sentence circled in Naomi's neat, blunt script. If you must make them pay, make the world better for others while you do. The words held the shape of a strategy that was not empty revenge, but stewardship that served double duty. It was the kind of instruction that made retribution into a reform. Maya held Naomi's key to her chest and, for the first time since she found it, understood the scale of the work ahead. She would not be monstrous. She would be meticulous. She would be patient, and somewhere down the line, Marcus would fail the one test that mattered. But for now, Harold's calendar sat open on her phone with suggested dates. Trustees needed to be appointed. Papers needed signatures. The river of time moved sluggishly, obliging her to allow weeks to pass while the machinery warmed up for action. She folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope with practiced tenderness. Then she slept, in the rented room, with Naomi's last line like a compass on her bedside table. Choose your people. Choose your causes. Choose what to make loud. If you love stories where the underdog becomes untouchable, hit subscribe. The first orders Maya gave were small and surgical. She did not storm boardrooms with accusations. She signed documents that opened doors to rooms where decisions are made by committees and contracts, not by rage. The trustees, Harold, Margaret, and the asset manager, had drafted a holding structure Naomi had already sketched in the margins of her ledger. Ashford Strategic Holdings, a UK-registered vehicle with a US operating arm. It would be the clean spine through which assets could be moved, consolidated, or quietly redirected. The name felt ceremonial when she first saw it on the paperwork, a line that tied her to a family she had only known by aprons and late-night stories. Maya spent the next months learning an unfamiliar grammar. The words were the same: valuation, due diligence, fiduciary duty. But the clauses carried the weight of people's livelihoods. She read diligence reports until the ink blurred into narrative. She watched video presentations from consultants who explained liquidity, covenant agreements, and earnouts as if narrating a trial. She signed authorizations for anonymous holding accounts. She learned to listen to the measured voices of professionals and to keep her own voice low, deliberate. When the advisors suggested it, she asked for timeframes. Weeks became months. Moves that mattered had to be patient. Naomi had built a fortress out of slow things. Market reaction, governance structures, contractual clauses. Those were the hammers she could use that would leave no visible mark on her hands. Her first target was not a revenge spectacle, but a governance correction. Kimball & Associates, the ad firm where Marcus had grown comfortable in middle management, had been profitable at times and at other times moribund, dependent on a few large clients and an internal culture that rewarded charm over discipline. Harold and the trustees argued that inserting stronger governance into a firm like Kimball, one of Naomi's many holdings, could both protect the asset and correct the rot that men like Marcus thrived in. They proposed a slow takeover, an anonymous purchase of a minority stake through Ashford Strategic Holdings, followed by an incremental appointment of independent directors and a mandate to tighten client retention policies. The acquisition itself looked almost anticlimactic on paper. A bid was made, accepted, financing arranged through a syndicate Naomi had used for decades. The firm changed hands in a way that the press would later call quiet and methodical. To the outside world, a hedge fund had purchased a stake. Internally, the new board, which now included a financial operations expert and a compliance officer, began to ask questions that no one at Kimball had been comfortable answering in public. Where were the renewal letters? Which accounts had been grandfathered with non-standard terms? Who exactly carried the institutional memory of client relationships? Marcus noticed the changes before he could name them. At first they were small irritations, new forms to sign, client satisfaction metrics popping up in dashboards, a quiet memo reminding staff that bonuses were now tied to measurable retention rates and net promoter scores. Then came the audits, third-party reviews of client billing and project delivery. Marcus, who had made a career out of charm and improvisation, found himself in email threads asking for deliverables and timelines, in a voice that left no room for improvisation. His clients, used to him smoothing over mistakes with personality, began to demand numbers and predictability. One by one, sensitive accounts were transferred to senior account leads whose names Marcus had to Google. Marcus's luck was the kind that had always been social rather than structural. He had been promoted in the old times of Kimball when relationships outweighed spreadsheets. The new board wanted predictable revenue. They wanted contracts tied to performance clauses. They wanted a compliance officer who could answer to auditors in plain language. Marcus's instinct to improvise was suddenly a liability. At home he called Maya fewer times. When he did call, his voice was careful and strained. He was the one who had asked for separation, and now the parts of his life that once seemed inevitable were wobbling. He texted Shanice late at night with fragments of worry. She answered with bright optimism and private plans and promises. She had always been audacious, someone who believed growth was a matter of appetite and the right smile. When the audits flagged irregularities in operations at Lemon Suites, the boutique hotel group where Shanice had won a regional reputation for hospitality hustle, it was not because the auditors wanted to cause harm. It was because the trust had invested in Lemon Suites some years before as a stabilizing play. Naomi had liked small hotels for their steady cash flow, and the board now required transparency and profit-aligned management. Maya's second move was surgical in a different way. Lemon Suites had been underperforming in pockets. Its books were messy. The management structure relied heavily on local favors and flexible accounting. Rather than a scandalous takeover, Margaret advised a strategy Maya appreciated for being mercilessly practical. Acquire a controlling interest through an intermediary, then place Diane Porter, a CEO Naomi had noted in a margin years earlier, into a position of operational leadership. Diane was everything Naomi praised. Ironclad on contracts, unflappable in rewrites of employee handbooks, and blunt about the cost of sentiment when it jeopardized the bottom line. Maya sat in a conference room for their first meeting with Diane. The woman had a voice like a measured metronome and an insistence on facts. "I'm not here for revenge," Diane said bluntly, as if answering an unasked question. "I'm here to run a business. People who don't meet their obligations will be moved out. That is not personal, it is governance." It was both harsher and more merciful than Maya expected. Diane's methods were surgical: tighten procurement, renegotiate vendor contracts, implement an occupancy-based incentive structure for regional managers, and institute a formal HR compliance program. The same compliance that had unsettled Marcus now flowed through the hotel chain. Shanice, who had relied on charm and quick fixes, found herself having to justify line items and reconcile spreadsheets. She treated the audits as an inconvenience at first. Then, in a quiet human scene, she sat in a small HR office and watched as a laptop screen showed shortages and inconsistencies she had not expected to be asked to explain. None of these measures were dramatic by themselves. They took months. They required lawyers, board votes, shareholder notices, interim management directives, and the patient sorting of KPIs. But for people whose careers were built on breezy confidence, the slow attrition of structure felt like a retribution that would not be televised but would be felt in bank balances and credibility. Marcus's decline was not linear. There were moments where he held on. The one client he had nurtured since early days renewed, a pitch went through, a senior colleague took pity and covered for him. But the board's new policies made covering up impossible to maintain as a habit. Clients who wanted stability shifted accounts to teams that could produce reports on time. Bonuses evaporated under the new performance metrics. Marcus found himself increasingly excluded from key meetings, his calendar populated with remedial sessions and courses on professional standards. He responded with the mix of denial and trembling anger people use when Everest begins to reveal itself. Shanice's unraveling was quieter and more public. The Lemon Suites audits revealed discrepancies in vendor contracts and payroll entries. There were uncomfortable HR conversations, then a board vote, then a meeting where Diane, composed and direct, explained that Shanice's leadership style, informal, improvisational, no longer fit the chain's strategy. "We will offer a transition package," Diane said in that voice that removed sentiment and left only consequence. "We will assist with placement, but the performance issues are documented. Shanice expected outrage from Maya. She expected a public vindication, a phone call that would plant the seed of humiliation. Instead, there was silence from Maya that was colder than any accusation. At a staff meeting where Shanice faced colleagues who had depended on her, someone mentioned the scholarship Naomi had founded and how the chain intended to partner with the foundation to support hospitality apprenticeships. Shanice watched the room shift. The narrative had moved from her personhood to the institution's ability to deliver programs. Her name lost its performance of centrality. They both, Marcus and Shanice, blamed each other and then blamed a world that had become unknowable. In quiet moments, Marcus sat at his kitchen table and thumbed old photos of him and Maya, trying to remember what had been real. Shanice called old friends and insisted that the audits were unfair, that she had been set up by corporate people who did not appreciate the nuance of running a hotel where the staff were like family. They both found consolation in one another, until the shared consolation dried out into a brittle, rehearsed animosity. Maya watched all of it carefully, in the way someone watches weather from the safety of an upstairs room. She did not gloat. She sent no threatening emails. She let the structure do its work. It was slower than any fevered revenge she had imagined in the first weeks, but it was inexorable. When Kimball's board voted to require quarterly client retention metrics tied to performance bonuses, Marcus's particular methods proved unsustainable. When Lemon Sweets tightened procurement and required verifiable vendor contracts, Shanice's informal arrangements unraveled. When both firms lost clients or lost credence with investors, the ripple effects extended into their private lives. Delayed loan approvals, mortgage pressures, a canceled engagement chatter that stood like a rumor until it hardened into a fact. The trustees, always playing the long game, suggested Maya prepare a public move that would be both moral and strategic, a philanthropic initiative that would bind Naomi's name to an irrevocable public good. Naomi had written that the scholarship must be irrevocably useful. The trustees advised making that promise public in a way that would not reveal operational specifics of the trust. It would be a bright, unassailable act, one the press could cover but not weaponize. When the day of the announcement was set, the press described it in the kind of language that lives on headlines. Ashford Trust announces Naomi Richardson Scholarship, a Trillionaire legacy pledges education for girls. The phrase Trillionaire legacy stuck. It was a tempting colonial of adjectives that glued the public imagination to a scale they could not easily grasp. Headlines splashed the figure the documents had given, an estimated consolidated peak valuation of $1.1 trillion. Reporters debated the number on panels that used graphics of zeros like ornaments. Online, the story became a small constellation of talking points and hot takes. Maya chose a quiet moment to unveil the scholarship. It was not at a flashy press conference, but at a community center Naomi had once volunteered at, a room where cinderblock walls bore children's drawings and a fluorescent lamp hummed with the sound of an ordinary city. Margaret stood with her as the trustees read the terms aloud: an endowment for girls from Naomi's old neighborhood, scholarships for public health and community leadership, a fund managed to ensure money went directly to tuition and mentorship, not to administrative frills. It was, in every letter, the kind of public good Naomi had sketched: direct, durable, and hard to cast into scandal. The media came anyway. They came with cameras and warm-ups and the soft choreography of people who had spent careers shaping narratives into neat packages. They would later show footage of Maya walking into the room, but those who had been there remembered the smallness of her entrance. A woman in a dark coat, shoulders steady, the brass key in her purse perhaps, her face composed into the slow architecture of someone who had learned to hold still. The applause was polite and then earnest. Faces in the crowd, teenagers, volunteers, older women with hands worn by years, clapped as if a light had been turned on. Maya read Naomi's letter aloud in parts, a soft voice that carried across the room. Make it irrevocably useful. She spoke briefly about stewardship and the danger of letting money make people smaller. She did not name Marcus or Shanice. She did not need to. The moment that the camera crews asked for a question, Marcus appeared at the back of the room with Shanice beside him, a hesitant presence as if they had been invited to the wrong play. They had driven in from the suburbs, The world had tightened around them in ways that made their gestures look humble, where they once had seemed assured. Marcus's tie was slightly askew. Shanice's hair had grown longer under the strain of late nights and anxious calls that had not produced the results she expected. They did not approach the podium. They remained in the back like shadows. The press noticed, of course. Their presence was a human interest layer to the spectacle. But when someone asked Marcus for a comment afterward, he gave a statement of careful ambiguity about being pleased for the community and proud she is giving back. Shanice, more raw, said she hoped the new program helps people get chances she always wished she had. The gala that followed in a downtown hotel, one Naomi had once considered but never announced publicly, was a stage for the transformation. Donors asked to be photographed with Maya. Trustees gave short, measured testimonials. Reporters who had gossiped about Naomi's past now framed the story as one of redemption and intentionality. Maya moved through the room with a strange immunity. The fortune she now stewarded had become public property in the best sense, an engine for places Naomi had loved, and a mirror for the community's needs. Marcus and Shanice arrived late to the gala. They stood at the edge of the room and watched a handful of people approach Maya with admiration that had nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with what the money would do. Marcus's face, once practiced for smiles, hardened in a way that was almost carved. Shanice touched his arm as if to keep him from acting. They lingered long enough for people to notice, and long enough for cameras to register the drama of their attendance. But no one pelted them with questions that mattered. The cameras were on Maya. The community's response was not theatrical revenge. It was a reallocation of attention. Young women who might have been fodder for gossip now had tuition assistance. Community clinics received funds earmarked for mental health services Naomi had listed in a margin. A new apprenticeship program for hospitality workers, ironically tied to the properties Diane was stabilizing, began to draft its first cohorts. Marcus's professional collapse accelerated. One client cited concerns over account continuity and selected a competitor with a more robust governance framework. Another large account, after a whisper of doubt, requested a review and found misaligned billing practices that could not be retroactively smoothed. Marcus, removed from strategic account pitches, watched colleagues who once deferred to his charm earn promotions he could not attain. The world continued to revolve without him at the center. Shanice, facing the termination at Lemon Sweets, found herself publicly described in local columns as a hospitality manager who once built a boutique brand from the ground up, and then, in less flattering copy, a casualty of corporate restructuring. Friends she had relied on to provide cover in early days now sent perfunctory condolence messages and then passed on job leads in distant cities. Their relationship, once a refuge from the quiet limits of small lives, became a brittle thing, creaking under the pressure of lost income and private shame. There were short human moments where both Marcus and Shanice considered asking Maya for help. Shanice sent a tentative email asking for advice on rebuilding a small personal brand. Marcus drafted a text that would have asked for a meeting to clear the air. Maya read neither. She had chosen a different path. Not humiliation, but distance. Not spectacle, but structure. There was, in her silence, a kind of mercy and a kind of boundary. As the months moved, the market and the boards did most of her work. The measures Naomi had tucked among ledgers, clauses that allowed for executive replacement in cases of mismanagement, the appointment of independent directors, the requirement for audited transparency, were legal levers that required time to pull. But once pulled, they changed incentives. People who had thrived in opaque environments found the oxygen thin. Maya's education continued too. She began to learn how to appoint a board member, how to read a shareholder agreement, how to listen to an investor presentation without panic. Harold and Margaret taught but did not infantilize. Diane tested her with questions about mission and margins. Naomi's voice, dry and instructive in the pages, became more present in Maya's mind. Choose what to make loud, she had written. Maya chose programs over punishment. She chose institutions over revenge. She also chose accountability. There were days when that choice felt unsatisfactory in an animal part of her chest that wanted immediate retribution. The human heart does not always abide patient justice. There were nights she allowed herself small, private indulgences. A photograph of Naomi propped by a bedside lamp, a letter she wrote and did not send, a moment in which she imagined Marcus and Shanice reduced to stories told at gatherings, with a moral chord struck for effect. But in daylight she adhered to Naomi's plan. Let the lawyers do the work. Let the auditors document the facts. Let the market and governance structures reconfigure rooms. The press, too, played its role. Headlines that had once tried to reduce Naomi to a modest life now reconsidered her. Journalists called Naomi the woman who had quietly amassed one of the largest private portfolios in the country, and wrote profiles that tried to reconcile mismatched images. A cafeteria potluck queen who had been a patient, clandestine investor. Many pieces were clumsy. Others tried to find a moral. The self-made woman who refused the spectacle. Columnists argued about the ethical implications of wealth held in secret. Op-eds debated whether money earned stealthily deserved to dictate public goods. The word trillionaire remained a clickbait magnet. Maya let the noise wash over her. Once the media attention peaked and began to settle into regular coverage, Maya made another deliberate move. She inaugurated the Naomi Richardson Foundation with an internal governance structure designed to avoid the common pitfalls trusts face when tragedy meets trustee turnover. The foundation's board included Naomi's old friend from the community center, a respected university dean, and a young activist Naomi had once quietly sponsored. Their first initiative was a multi-year scholarship program tied to mentorship and internship placements within Naomi's rehabilitated properties, including Lemon Suites and other hospitality holdings, where apprentices could learn not just hospitality, but financial literacy and operations. Diane oversaw the apprenticeship program with the exacting attention she brought to dinner service and procurement. "We can teach someone to make a bed perfectly," Diane told Maya once, "but we can also teach them how to run the ledger. That's where stability starts." The apprenticeship, pragmatic and earnest, became a model that other hospitality groups took notice of. Local papers began to print profiles of scholarship recipients. A girl from Naomi's old neighborhood who became the first in her family to attend college, a young woman who earned a certificate and then a managerial role within Lemon Suites. Maya attended graduation ceremonies and watched the ripple of impact. She sat in a folding chair and clapped until her hands ached. Naomi's handwriting, framed and placed on her office wall, looked like an instruction manual and a love letter at once. "Make it irrevocably useful," a nun from the community center said to a reporter, and the phrase became a small public talisman. For Marcus and Shanice, the consequences were incontrovertible. Marcus found new work eventually, in a smaller firm that appreciated his salesmanship but subjected him to strict oversight. He took night classes to shore up credentials he had neglected. He looked smaller in photographs, less certain, aware that his former life had relied on a particular cultural capital that no longer transferred easily. Shanice moved out of the city, took a consultancy role in a different region, and began a blog where she wrote about hospitality with frankness and an undercurrent of regret. Neither of them sent wedding invitations. Neither of them prospered in the same way again. There were, in those months, small human reconciliations that did not erase consequence. Marcus volunteered at a youth program funded by the Naomi Richardson Foundation, teaching underprivileged kids to put together a project pitch. Shanice visited a cohort of hospitality apprentices to talk candidly about failure and recovery. Those moments were not admissions of guilt in public. They were attempts at repair in private lives now restructured by accountability. Maya's revenge, never described as such in public, had achieved what Naomi's marginalia promised. Correction that prioritized public good. The people who had hurt her had stumbled under institutional pressures and market realities. The world around Naomi's name began to change in small ways. More scholarships, clinics with extended hours, an apprenticeship program that fed directly into jobs, and a foundation that refused to be used by opportunists. Still, money changes things in ways that are not always clean. There were donors who wanted influence. There were activists who demanded more radical redistribution. There were legal teams parsing line items for ways to maximize impact without exposing the trust to unnecessary liability. Maya navigated those tensions with a steadying hand. She appointed oversight committees, listened to community voices, and argued, sometimes fiercely, with trustees about the balance between prudence and boldness. Naomi's voice nudged her toward a middle path. Do not be showy, she had written, but do not be timid either. The personal closure Maya experienced was quieter than she, or others, might have expected. There was no televised confrontation, no dramatic revelation that left Marcus and Shanice on their knees. Instead, there were small moments that registered like ellipses, and then became a closure of a different kind. Marcus called once, years later, to say he had remarried someone kind and was building a life that didn't hurt others. Shanice, in a long email, confessed that she had been selfish and immature, and that losing the job had been the hardest teacher she had known. Maya read both messages. She did not reply at length. The words were both a closing and a beginning. She felt neither triumph nor pity, rather a steadying clarity that came from knowing the ledger had been balanced by systems, not a private vengeance. The Naomi Richardson Scholarship grew, slowly but reliably. The Foundation's first cohort of scholars, 10 young women, graduated to jobs and public service posts. Local hospitals received funds earmarked for community mental health programs Naomi had prioritized in her notebook. Lemon Suites, under Diane's leadership, became a model for hospitality that emphasized sustainable operations and fair labor practices, an irony not lost on those who had once minimized Shanice's fast-moving energy. At night, Maya sometimes sat by the window of her penthouse, an apartment Sophie, Naomi's oldest friend, had called too much when Maya had accepted it as an office on the top floor of one of Naomi's holdings, and she read the letter Naomi had written aloud to empty rooms. Keep your hands clean. Let the institutions do the work. The words landed differently with the passage of time. They were not an instruction to be passive. They were an argument for intentional structures. She kept the brass key in a small glass box on her desk, a talisman rather than a tool. It sat beside a photograph of Naomi smiling on a bench. The key had opened box 447 and, in a sense, opened a life of choices as well. Maya sometimes imagined Naomi watching, pragmatic, a little proud, perhaps a little exasperated that things had required so much time. There were occasional nights when Naomi's absence felt like a physical ache. She would go to the community center and sit in the back of meetings, listening as educators debated curriculum, as young people argued their potentials into a future. She would visit scholarship recipients, attend the occasional board meeting, and sign papers where her own name appeared not as a headline, but as a steward. Her handwriting, in select documents, was neat and decisive. Years later, when the audits of Naomi's estate had settled into the predictable rhythms trustees expect, annual reports, compliance filings, public impact statements, Maya stood once more in front of a small audience at a community hall. She had not become a public celebrity. She had become a steward, a person with visible scars that were not of violence, but of endurance. She read a passage from Naomi's last note. Money will change things about you. It will make everything louder. Choose what to make louder. The crowd listened, quiet and attentive. A reporter asked her afterwards a question that had been lurking in the minds of many. Did you ever want them to hurt? It was a blunt, human question. Maya paused and smiled, a small, honest thing. I wanted justice to be about making things right, not making people suffer, she said. Naomi taught me to use power to create stability. That is not always quick. It is not always clean. But it is, I think, kinder and more permanent. The public record, of course, preserved the more sensational fragments, the headline that had called Naomi a trillionaire, the viral photo of the scholarship dinner that people shared in debates about wealth and obligation. But the real measures of change were smaller, harder to clip for social media. A clinic's new hours, a scholarship recipient's graduation photo, a hotel company that finally paid living wages and delivered apprenticeships that led to careers. Maya kept Naomi's moral line as a compass. She had stood at the hospital window that night when the rain blurred the world into watercolor and promised a dying woman she would be careful who she trusted. She had kept that promise not only by withholding the secret, but by turning it into a carefully governed public good. The choices she had made were not vindictive stones cast into a pond. They were investments in structures that would, long after names blurred in print. Keep giving. In the quiet of her office, when the city hummed like a distant ocean, she picked up the small brass key and turned it in her fingers. The ridges had worn smooth. Naomi's handwriting, now framed and on the wall, caught the light. Maya read aloud, soft and steady, a line she had learned to carry as both instruction and consolation. If you must make them pay, make the world better for others while you do. There was no triumphant shout. There was no taste for gloating. Instead, there was work, meetings with school principals, late nights reviewing grant applications, conversations with Diane about scaling the apprenticeship program, and careful oversight of trust disbursements. The river of time continued to flow, and Maya stood as a dam and as a bridge, something that slowed certain tides and redirected others toward useful shores. Once, on a particularly still evening, a letter arrived in an envelope whose stamps caught the light. It was from an old neighbor of Naomi's who had helped her haul groceries in winter. The note contained a photograph. A young woman, scholarship recipient, sitting at a kitchen table with a stack of textbooks and a cup of tea, a look of fierce concentration on her face. She is my neighbor now, the letter said in handwriting that trembled with pride and gratitude. You made something that lasts. Maya put the photograph on her desk beside the little glass box where the brass key slept. She looked out over the skyline where lights flickered like small constellations and felt for the first time in a long while something like peace, the steady kind that grows when decisions align with the kind of person you want to be. Naomi had taught her to be patient and to be precise. She had taught her the paradox that power, when bound to purpose, could be a kind of mercy. In the end, the cost Marcus paid was not merely professional loss but the recognition that some tests have nothing to do with charm or bravado. He had failed, not because a woman held a secret, but because he had been unable to adapt to a world that required competence beyond persona. Shanice had failed because improvisation in the long run cannot replace structures that protect workers and customers alike. Maya did not take pleasure in their failure. She took satisfaction in a different ledger: students in classrooms, clinics with hours on their doors, apprentices who earned wages and more than that, who learned systems as a way to keep themselves safe. She honored Naomi by turning a private fortune into a public set of possibilities, and by doing so she answered the question Naomi had posed in a small, heavily inked line. What kind of person will you be when you have more than you ever expected? Maya folded Naomi's final note and placed it in the drawer of her desk, the same drawer where she kept the small things that mattered: a photograph, a pressed hydrangea, a ticket stub from the first scholarship ceremony. She closed the drawer gently and rose to meet another day of stewardship: board meetings, site visits, conversations with young people who had never known Naomi, but were now part of a life she had built. Outside, a storm gathered on the horizon like something that could be weathered. Maya watched it for a moment, feeling the old metaphor settle in her chest, that storms break what is brittle and reveal what is strong. Naomi had left her a key and a set of instructions. Maya had used them to turn betrayal into structure, confusion into programs, and grief into a steady force for public good. Would you forgive, or would you make them pay? Leave your answer below.